panel is a relevant topic and then relevant participants for the panel. So our topic is capabilities and capacity for the U.S. Army. I think the need for adequate Army capacity and capability has never been more evident. Just a few days ago, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Paul Selva, had some comments that I think are really emblematic of the challenges we face now. He talked about DoD has been plunged back into great power competition against both Russia and China, while some of the normal regional threats such as Korea and Iran are closing the capabilities gap. At the same time, General Selva noted that DoD probably has to address persistent threats such as ISIL and its derivatives for perhaps as long as the next 25 years. Interestingly, General Selva cited emerging lessons learned from Russian operations in Ukraine and Syria. The key emerging lesson is that the Army has the strongest tactical deterrence role in EUCOM with key capability requirements for heavy Army armor, rapid C2, cyber EW, countering long-range artillery, and combat vehicle active protection systems. So obviously the topic of capacity and capability is relevant. I believe we have a relevant panel. We have here a collection of soldiers, historians, scholars, strategists, and capability developers. If I gave you a quiz on matching those roles to the faces you see in front of you, you'd find that most of them have multiple roles. In fact, all of them have multiple roles. So we'll start with Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. He is Director of ARCIC, the Army Capabilities and Integration Center at Fort Eustis. Previous command assignments include Commanding General Maneuver Center of Excellence at Fort Benning. He was also the commander of the Anti-Corruption Task Force in Kabul, Afghanistan, and commander of the 3rd ACR. HR holds a doctorate in military history from the University of North Carolina, so obviously he's a historian, but also a scholar and a strategist and a soldier, and of course, running ARCIC, the head capability developer. He's going to talk about the relationships between capability and technology today and in the near future, and some of the myths and trends we have to deal with in addressing this topic. We've got Dr. Conrad Crane, soldier, historian, scholar. He is the director, Chief of Historical Services for the Army Heritage and Education Center at Carlisle Barracks. Previously, he was director of the U.S. Military History Institute, and he was with SSI as well. He's a bit of a Renaissance man. He's currently finishing a book on the Naval Institute Press about the creation and application of American counterinsurgency doctrine, and another book on the other end of the spectrum about American strategic bombing in World War II. And Conrad's going to address some of the historical trends the U.S. Army has experienced with respect to the relationship between capacity and technical surprise. We've got General Williams Hicks. He is the DAMO SS and the Army Staff Director of Strategy, Plans, and Policy. Prior to that, he was the Deputy Director at ARCIC. Bill's wartime assignments include Commander of the Afghan Regional Security Integration Command South in 2008 and 2009. Later, he was Chief of Staff for the Combined Security Transition Command Afghanistan and Chief of Strategy for Multinational Forces Iraq. I'm sorry, that wasn't later, that was before. Bill is obviously a strategist in his current role as the Army's Chief Strategist, also a soldier, capability developer, and a scholar. He holds an MMAS in Military Arts and Science. He is a National Security Fellows from the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Bill's going to talk about U.S. defense strategy, some of our most pressing capability and capacity requirements, and our recent operational experiences in that area. We have Dr. Nadia Shadlow. She is the Senior Program Director at the Smith Richardson Foundation. So Nadia is the only person with a real undergraduate degree at the table because all the rest of us are West Point grads. She's a graduate of the Cornell University and holds an MA and a doctorate from the Johns Hopkins NITSE School of Advanced International Studies, or SICE. At Smith Richardson, Nadia identifies strategic issues that warrant further attention from the U.S. academic community and the policy community. She develops grant portfolios on key topics with a particular focus on the U.S. military and its approach to stability and reconstruction operations. Nadia served on the Defense Policy Board from 2006 to 2009. She's a full member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Her dissertation on war and the art of governance is just about to be published. Nadia is going to talk about capabilities and capacity, the need to consolidate gains, and ground force sizing and stability operations. Finally, we have General John Wharton. John is CG of the U.S. Army Research, Development, and Engineering Command. His previous assignments include being CG at Rock Island, CG of AMC SWA, U.S. Army Central G4 CFLIC C4, quite a mouthful, for Operations Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom. He was commander of the 55th Theater Support Command. Of interest to the local community, he was AMC Chief of Staff from 2009 to 2012. And John is going to be able to address some of the technologies we need to ensure overmatch against emerging threat capabilities. Without further introduction, I'd like to go ahead and start off with General McMaster.
Thanks, General Fassman, and what a privilege it is to be with everybody here. I just want to thank all who came to this tremendous conference, and especially thank our partners in industry who we don't oftentimes get to thank enough. And you'll never know how many soldiers will get to see their children grow up because of the capabilities you help deliver to our armed forces. As Dave mentioned, our nation needs ready land forces capable of operating in sufficient scale and for ample duration to accomplish the mission as part of joint interorganizational multinational teams. As General Hicks, I'm sure, will talk about, and you'll see from really his discussion, our Army needs capabilities and also needs capacity. And what does that mean? I mean, what that means is capabilities are really what we need to be able to create a certain effect on the battlefield. Capabilities are really the ability to achieve that desired effect under specified standards. And then capacity is that capability with sufficient scale and endurance to accomplish the mission. And I think what we see today is that risk is increasing to national security. Risk because we now have an Army that may prove to be too small and also lack critical capabilities to overmatch future enemies and win. And win is getting to a sustainable outcome that brings us into a fight to begin with. And so that risk, I think, is in the mission, and that risk, I think, is also accruing to our soldiers. So in short, future Army forces may be not only outnumbered, and we've been outnumbered in the past, but we also may face enemies who have overmatched capability over us in some key areas. And as we see, obviously, in Europe in particular, that we may have Army forces that are also, to some degree, out of position to deter conflict or then to respond to and resolve conflict. And I think really that is because this risk is increasing because of two fundamental factors. And I think Conrad Crane will touch on this when he talks about really the only thing that should surprise us in war is if we're not surprised. Okay, we're always surprised by something in war. And that first reason is, I think, the relationship between capability and capacity is changing. The trend since World War I has been that technology has allowed smaller and smaller combat forces to have greater and greater effects on the battlefield, based on mechanization, based on the automotive revolution, the air power revolution, and the radio. But I think what we're seeing now is a shift in that because of the ease of technology transfer to our enemies. And whereas before we could rely on really our ability to achieve superiority and in recent years dominate or have supremacy in the maritime, aerospace domains, and then be able to project power onto land from those domains, our ability to dominate in those fluid domains of the aerospace and maritime domains is challenged. And so as is our ability to project power onto land. I think we see this, we see harbingers of this, for example, in Ukraine, where Russia has established air supremacy over Ukraine from the ground. And so now we have these so-called A2AD, anti-access air denial environments we have to deal with. The second fundamental reason, I think John Wharton will talk about this, is that disruptive enemy capabilities are now challenging what had been our differential advantages in close combat and in combat as a joint force. And so what are these that we see on display in eastern Ukraine as an example, but more broadly, I think, with other modernizing militaries? First of all, sophisticated air defense, which I already mentioned, very capable anti-tank weapon systems, unmanned aerial systems, and the potential for swarm unmanned aerial systems capabilities, long-range fires where we are outranged by very destructive long-range rocket artillery, for example, advanced combat vehicles when we have not invested to keep pace with potential adversaries who now have advanced combat vehicles with active protective systems, for example, cyber and electronic warfare capabilities, right? A lot of our advantage had been our ability to share information, the network strike capability. But what we're seeing now is those capabilities are under threat from cyber warfare, from electronic warfare, and also from counter-satellite capabilities. So this is the second reason why that relationship between, or that trend between capability and capacity, where you could trade off capacity for a narrow range of technological capabilities, I think it's bottomed out and is now turning up when capacity is very important. Capacity in ready land forces. So what are the implications? The first implication is what the Chief of Staff of the Army, which General Milley has emphasized. We better be ready. We better have well-trained, confident, cohesive teams who know how to operate all of their systems, all their weapons, under all conditions of combat. The second implication is it means the size of the Army is important. The size of the Army is important because we have to not only fight, but as Nadia will talk about, as Dr. Shadlow will talk about, we also have to consolidate gains to get sustainable outcomes. The third is we need to develop capabilities to cope with enemy disruptive capabilities, but we have to develop capabilities to maintain overmatch, right? We don't want a fair fight. If we show up with U.S. Army on our chest in large numbers, you're going to get your ass kicked, okay? And we have to make sure that our enemies understand that. And so what's important for us is to understand why we need capability and capacity. We need it to conduct expeditionary maneuver. We need it to develop situational understanding in close contact with the enemy and civilian populations. We need it to conduct joint combined arms maneuver, which really elevates the tactics of infiltration to the operational level. Combined arms at lower levels, air-ground teams that can see and fight across wider areas. Teams that have the mobility, protection, and lethality to overmatch the enemy. We need capability and capacity, as already mentioned, to consolidate gains and get to sustainable outcomes, to secure territory and populations. And then in the future, even more and more, we're going to need to project power outward from land into the maritime, aerospace, cyberspace domains to ensure freedom of movement and action for the joint force. What are some of those capabilities? We can talk more about that, and you'll hear more about that from an awesome panel coming up that will be chaired by Major General Bo Dias. But the key thing, I think, are us to focus on those implications. We need all three. We need to be ready, we need the capacity, and we need the capability. And we can talk maybe in Q&A about myths that I think are leading to, that are leading to a lack of recognition that we need to achieve and maintain that balance in ready land forces. And I'll be followed by General Hicks. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak for a few minutes this morning. So I think the first point that we have to consider is the fact that the strategic and operational environment of the next 25 years will not be like the last. We are now in an era of constant competition and conflict, marked by the rise of at least one, if not two, great powers who will compete with us in every possible domain. We have not faced an existential, technologically and operationally sophisticated, and nuclear capable threat since the collapse of the USSR, but we are likely to face one and possibly two over the coming decades. However, we will get no reprieve from what we have come to know as our current fight, deterring North Korea and Iran, countering violent extremist organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, continuing to work to consolidate gains in Afghanistan and regain lost ground in Iraq. Instability, disorder, and conflict will continue and are likely to increase as we move into the future. The operational environment, regardless of the threat, will be much faster, more lethal, consequential, and unforgiving.